What if I told you British history isn't just crowns, cannons, and stiff upper lip, but a long-running experiment in who can be punished for existing? What if the most civilized laws were often just sophisticated ways to make hunger illegal? And what if the stories you were taught were carefully padded, like a hard chair with a thin, polite cushion, so you wouldn't feel the nails underneath? Tonight we're going to pull that cushion away, not with conspiracy, with records, court reports, parliamentary arguments, and the kind of everyday details that school lessons quietly step around. We'll move through the facts that don't fit the pageant version of Britain. Facts about poverty treated as crime, labour treated as expendable, and power treated as a birthright that never met a rule it couldn't bend. If you want more long, slow, story-rich history like this, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It tells the algorithm you're the kind of person who prefers truth over comforting wallpaper. Now, dim the lights. Let's begin. Fact 1. Vagrancy made poverty a police matter. In the early 19th century, Britain's streets were full of people moving, looking for work, fleeing eviction following seasonal labour, or simply trying not to starve. The setup sounds ordinary. A traveller with a bundle, a man sleeping rough, a woman asking for a penny. Except the law often treated that movement as suspicious by default. The Vagrancy Act of 1824 was meant, on paper, to tackle rogues and vagabonds. In practice, it gave police broad power to arrest people for being poor in public, begging, sleeping outdoors, even looking like you might be intending to beg. The revelation isn't just cruelty, it's convenience. If poverty is a moral failing, then the state doesn't have to fix wages, rents, or hunger. It can just hand the problem to a constable. Historical court records and press reports show the petty, grinding rhythm. Short sentences, hard labour, repeated arrests, names reappearing like a sad chorus. The consequence was a revolving door, prison as shelter, punishment as policy, and a lesson repeated until it sank in. Visibility was a crime. And speaking of visibility, the next system didn't just hide poverty, it processed it. Fact 2. The workhouse was designed to hurt just enough. The workhouse is often introduced as a grim charity, a roof, a meal, a last resort. That's the setup. The pivot is that the last resort was engineered to feel like a threat. After the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 in England and Wales, the principle was less eligibility. Relief inside the workhouse must be worse than the poorest labourer's life outside. Not equal, worse, because the suffering was the deterrent. So families were separated, husbands from wives, parents from children. You could be fed, but you would be stripped of autonomy, privacy, and dignity. Diets were monotonous and often meagre, with scandals erupting when conditions tipped from harsh to dangerous. The revelation is that cruelty wasn't an accident of bad management. It was part of the design brief. Parliamentary inquiries and local reports repeatedly describe the same logic. If assistance feels humane, the undeserving might seek it. So the system performed moral judgment through architecture and routine. High walls, uniforms, silence, supervised meals. The consequence was a nation that built institutions where hunger was treated like a character flaw, and then acted surprised when desperation didn't politely disappear. Meanwhile, the law had another favourite hobby, punishing debt, as if it were theft. Fact 3. Debtors' prisons kept people caged for being broke. Debt sounds like a private problem. Borrowed money, unpaid bills, misfortune. The setup in Georgian and early Victorian Britain was blunt. If you owed, you could be imprisoned. Debtors' prisons weren't rare curiosities. They were part of the machinery. Places like the Marshalsea and the Fleet became holding pens for those who couldn't pay, sometimes for astonishingly small sums. The pivot is that prison didn't help you repay. It made repayment harder. You couldn't earn, your family suffered, and the fees for keeping you confined could pile up like a cruel joke. The revelation is how normalized it was. Contemporary accounts describe families living inside prison with the debtor, because rent and survival didn't pause just because the state locked a man away. Some prisoners with money could buy better rooms, food, even entertainments, turning incarceration into a class system with bars. Reformers campaigned, scandals erupted, and laws shifted over the 19th century. But for decades, the message was clear. Financial failure was a moral stain, and the punishment was public humiliation plus confinement. And speaking of humiliation, let's talk about what happened when a woman had a child and a man didn't want the bill. Fact 4. Bastardy. Laws could make single mothers the easy target. Victorian morality loved neat stories. Respectable families, disciplined sexuality, consequences for sin. The setup for an unmarried mother was already brutal. Stigma, lost employment, social exile. The pivot is that the legal and welfare system often treated her as the primary problem to be managed, not a parent to be supported. Under the post-1834 poor law system, parishes were determined to reduce costs. One method was making relief conditional, scrutinised and morally charged, especially for women with illegitimate children. There were mechanisms to seek support from fathers, but proving paternity could be difficult and enforcement uneven. The revelation is that the burden of respectability became a financial tool. Shame did administrative work. Contemporary reports and debates show a recurring obsession with discouraging immorality, as if pregnancy were contagious and poverty were a punishment that could teach virtue. The consequence was predictable: women driven into desperate work, unsafe living, and sometimes abandonment. And the darkest irony, a system claiming to protect social order often destabilized the very households that might have survived with basic help. If you think that's harsh, wait until you see what counted as a hanging offence. Fact 5. The bloody code made property more sacred than life. Picture 18th century England. Growing cities, expanding trade, anxiety about crime. The setup is familiar. Authorities want order, people want safety. Except the law's definition of order was wildly tilted toward protecting property. Under what historians call the bloody code, a sprawling range of offences carried the death penalty, far beyond murder. Theft of certain goods, breaking into a house, stealing from shops, even some acts of forgery could, at various times, put you on a path to the gallows. The revelation isn't that everyone was executed, it's that the threat itself was a weapon. Court records and printed ordinaries' accounts and newspaper reports show how the death penalty hovered over ordinary desperation. Juries sometimes tried to soften outcomes by undervaluing stolen goods to avoid a hanging, which tells you something important. Even people inside the system could see it was excessive. The consequence was a society where the law announced loudly that a rich man's lock mattered more than a poor man's lung. And when hanging felt too final or too politically messy, Britain found another solution: export the problem. Fact 6. Transportation was punishment, labour supply and social dumping. Transportation is sometimes told as a swashbuckling tale. Ships, distant colonies, second chances. The setup: convicted criminals sent away to start anew. The pivot is that it was also a business-like method of removing undesirable people and stocking colonies with forced labour. From the late 18th century into the 19th, Britain transported tens of thousands, first to North America, until the American Revolution disrupted that route, then heavily to Australia. Many were convicted of property offences, some were repeat petty offenders, some were simply unlucky in a system designed to punish poverty. The revelation is how transportation served multiple agendas at once: domestic fear management, colonial labour needs, and the comforting fiction that crime could be shipped out like spoiled meat. Official records, ship manifests, and colonial administration documents show the scale and the bureaucratic normality of it. Humans processed as units. Conditions on ships varied, but the crossing was long. Disease was a constant threat, and separation from home was often permanent. And speaking of permanence, Britain also loved punishments that didn't technically kill you, but made sure you never forgot who owned your body. Fact 7. Public punishments were moral theatre with blood under the stage stocks, pillories, whipping posts. These weren't just punishments, they were performances. The setup was deterrence, make an example, discourage others. The pivot is that crowds didn't always behave like a neat morality lesson. Sometimes they sympathized, sometimes they jeered, sometimes they turned punishment into carnival. Whipping in particular could be savage. It was used on men, women, and sometimes the young. The revelation is that the state didn't just punish, it recruited the public eye as an accomplice. Shame was part of the sentence. Contemporary descriptions show how bodies were displayed and corrected in the open air. Even when Britain began moving away from public spectacle, executions shifting behind prison walls later in the 19th century, the logic remained. Punishment should feel socially cleansing, like scrubbing filth off the street. The consequence was a culture where cruelty could be framed as civic virtue, and where order often meant the powerful reassuring themselves that the poor knew their place. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was making new places to put bodies, indoors near machines for 12 or 14 hours at a time. Fact 8. Children were used as tools because their bodies fit the gaps. Factories didn't just need labour, they needed labour that was cheap, small and replaceable. That's the setup. The pivot is that children fit perfectly. In textile mills, children could crawl under machines, tie broken threads, clean in tight spaces, and move quickly between frames. They were paid less, disciplined more, and expected to endure conditions that would break many adults. The revelation is not simply child labour existed, it's that the system rationalised it as training, as discipline, as character building, while extracting maximum value from minimum costs. Parliamentary investigations in the 19th century gathered testimony from child workers and inspectors describing long hours, exhaustion, injuries and beatings. There were reforms, the Factory Acts, but enforcement was uneven, loopholes were common, and employers fought regulation like it was theft. The consequence was a generation of children who grew up with industrial hearing loss, stunted growth, chronic illness, and memories of fear timed to the rhythm of a machine. And speaking of tight spaces, some jobs weren't just exhausting, they were physically impossible for adults, which was exactly the point. Fact 9. Chimney sweeping relied on children because adults couldn't fit. If you want a single image of progress with rot inside it, take the chimney sweep child. The setup is almost storybook. Little sweep boys, soot-covered faces, a quaint urban trade. The pivot is that the work was terrifying. Children sent up narrow flues, sometimes naked or nearly so, scraping soot while choking and burning, with the constant risk of getting stuck. The revelation is how long it lasted despite public outrage. Reformers campaigned, writers and artists exposed the horror. Laws were passed, and still children continued to be used because enforcement was weak and employers found ways around restriction. Medical reports later described chimney sweeps cancer, an occupational cancer of the scrotum linked to soot exposure, one of the first industrial cancers identified. So the cruelty wasn't just immediate terror, it was slow disease, baked into childhood. The consequence was a job that shortened lives and left survivors scarred in ways polite society preferred not to picture. Meanwhile, underground Britain had its own version of this logic. Small bodies, narrow tunnels, cheap lives. Fact 10. Mines used women and children until public shame forced change. Coal-powered Britain. That's the setup, the fuel of factories, railways and urban life. The pivot is what it cost the people underground. In the early 19th century, it was common in some mining regions for women and children to work in mines, hauling coal in cramped seams, sometimes on hands and knees, sometimes tethered like draft animals. Accounts gathered by official inquiries described brutal hours, injuries, damp, darkness, and the constant threat of collapse or explosion. The revelation is that reform often came not purely from compassion, but from scandal. When the public learned about women working in conditions considered indecent, barefoot, stripped for heat, labouring alongside men, Moral outrage suddenly became a lever for legislation. The Mines and Collieries Act of 1842 banned women and girls from working underground and restricted boys under 10. The consequence is complicated. Some families lost income, some children were pushed into other dangerous jobs, but the larger truth remains. Britain's industrial wealth wasn't just mined from the earth, it was pulled through the lungs and spines of the poorest. And speaking of lungs, cities above ground had their own invisible killers, delivered straight to your water jug. Fact 11. Cholera wasn't just a disease, it was a class system in water form. When cholera hit Britain in the 19th century, it arrived like a judgment, sudden, violent and terrifying. The setup was panic, streets emptied, rumours spread, officials argued. The pivot is that cholera exposed how the city was built. Sewage and drinking water entangled in the same urban bloodstream. Working-class districts were crowded, sanitation was poor, and water sources were often contaminated. The revelation is that the disease wasn't evenly distributed by fate. It followed infrastructure and neglect. Reformers and investigators, most famously in London, pushed the idea that water sources mattered, challenging older theories that blamed vague miasmas alone. Public health reforms gradually followed, sewer projects, regulation, and the slow acceptance that clean water was not a luxury, but a survival requirement. Yet the pace was painfully political. Funding fights, private interests, and the eternal question, why spend money on people who can't vote or donate? The consequence was that disease became a quiet form of governance. If your neighbourhood was considered disposable, your body absorbed the policy. Meanwhile, the dead themselves became useful, sometimes in ways that turned grief into profit. Fact 12. Body-snatching fed medical science by stealing the poor. Medical schools needed bodies to teach anatomy. That's the setup, and it sounds almost noble. Knowledge, progress, saving lives. Except the supply of legal cadavers was limited, and demand was high, so resurrection men dug up fresh corpses and sold them. The pivot is who was targeted: the poor, whose graves were less protected, whose families couldn't afford guards, and whose lives had already been treated as cheap. The revelation is that scientific advancement rode in part on theft from those least able to resist. Contemporary newspapers and court cases describe graveyard security measures, iron cages called mort safes, watchmen, angry crowds. The scandal escalated with notorious murders committed to supply bodies, and the public horror forced legal change. The Anatomy Act of 1832 expanded the legal supply of bodies, including those who died in workhouses and charitable institutions without claimed relatives, which is where the cynicism deepens. The solution to body theft wasn't protecting the poor dead, it was making the poor dead more available. And speaking of helpful institutions, some reforms were sold as mercy while functioning like control. Fact 13. Asylums sometimes turn social problems into madness. Victorian asylums are often presented as a humanitarian step away from chains and abuse. The setup is reform, purpose-built hospitals, medical oversight, safety. The pivot is that the definition of madness could be elastic enough to include inconvenient people. Women with hysteria, men broken by poverty, the elderly with dementia, people with epilepsy. Many could end up institutionalized in systems that mixed care with confinement. Records from some institutions show genuine attempts at treatment alongside overcrowding, underfunding, and harsh discipline. The revelation is not that all asylums were torture chambers. It's that the system could swallow people who didn't fit and keep them out of sight. Once inside, leaving could be difficult. Families might abandon relatives. Doctors could disagree. Bureaucracy moved slowly, and the stigma meant society often preferred not to look too closely. The consequence was that mental health became a border police of normality, sometimes saving lives, sometimes burying them in routine. Meanwhile, Britain's political order had its own way of handling inconvenient crowds. Fact 14. Peterloo showed how quickly. Order meant Sabres Manchester 1819. The setup: Tens of thousands gather peacefully to demand parliamentary reform, representation, fairness, a voice. They came with families, they listened to speeches. They believed naively that being orderly would protect them. The pivot is what happened next. Local authorities panicked. Troops and yeomanry were sent in. The crowd was charged. People were cut down, trampled, crushed. Contemporary accounts describe chaos, screams, blood, the horrifying moment when a political meeting becomes a battlefield. The revelation is that the state response wasn't an accident of one bad decision. It reflected a wider fear among elites. Mass political participation looked like revolution, and Britain had been watching France. Afterward, rather than embracing reform, the government passed repressive measures, the Six Acts, tightening controls on meetings and publication. Official justifications leaned on public safety, as if the crowd had attacked the blade. The consequence was a blunt lesson. Rights were not granted because they were just. They were granted when refusing them became too dangerous. And speaking of dangerous ideas, workers organizing themselves were treated like a contagious disease. Fact 15. Early unions were criminalized as if wages were a state secret. It's easy to assume trade unions were always a normal part of industrial life. The setup in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was the opposite. Collective bargaining could be treated as conspiracy. The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 restricted workers from organizing for better wages or conditions. The pivot that employers weren't treated the same way. A group of owners could set wages and terms, but a group of workers doing the same could be branded a threat to the nation. Even after repeals and reforms, prosecution and intimidation continued. Workers could be fired, blacklisted, arrested. The revelation is that free market rhetoric often meant freedom for the people who already had bargaining power. Court cases and parliamentary debates show how the language of national stability was used against ordinary labour demand. Higher wages were framed as a kind of disorder, almost unpatriotic. The consequence was that industrial Britain ran on a paradox. It praised hard work while treating workers' collective voice as a criminal plot. If you think that was paranoid, meet the men who were shipped across the world for forming a friendly society. Fact 16. The Tolpuddle martyrs were punished for organising not violence. Dorset, 1834. The setup is modest. Agricultural labourers face low wages and hunger. They form a friendly society to support each other and bargain. The pivot is the state's response, not negotiation, but prosecution. Unable to comfortably convict them for union activity alone, authorities used an old law about administering unlawful oaths, something associated with mutiny and secret conspiracy. The revelation is the creativity of repression. When the obvious charge looks bad, find a technical one that sounds frightening. The men were sentenced to transportation to Australia. Public outrage followed. Petitions circulated. Large demonstrations took place. Eventually, they were pardoned and returned, but the damage was done. The state had made an example. The consequence wasn't just personal suffering. It was a warning to everyone watching. If you organize, the system will look for a legal hook, and it will find one. And speaking of hooks, Britain's empire had a habit of turning commerce into coercion, with paperwork as the rope. Fact 17. The opium wars were about trade, not civilization. School versions can make it sound like a clash of cultures or an inevitable meeting of worlds. The setup. Britain wants to trade with China. China restricts certain imports, tensions rise. The pivot is that Britain's solution involved pushing opium into Chinese markets to balance trade, and then using military force when Chinese authorities tried to suppress the drug trade. The revelation is uncomfortable. A major imperial conflict was in significant part about protecting a narcotics business because it served economic interests. Contemporary political debates and documents show the arguments. Some critics called it immoral. Others framed it as commercial necessity and national prestige. The wars ended with treaties that expanded British privileges and access, including the cession of Hong Kong after the First War. The broader consequence was a pattern. Moral language on the surface, hard economic calculation underneath. And once you've seen that pattern, you start noticing it everywhere, especially where Britain talked about improvement while extracting value. Fact 18. The empire's development often meant rearranging wealth. Upward imperial rhetoric loved the word improvement. Railways, ports, law courts, administration. The setup, a story of modernization. The pivot is that modernization often served imperial needs first, moving resources, enforcing taxation, securing military mobility, while local populations bore the disruptions. The revelation is not that infrastructure never helped anyone, it's that the direction of benefit was frequently upward and outward. Cash crops could replace subsistence farming. Traditional industries could be undermined by imperial trade policies. Tax systems could be reshaped to ensure revenue flows, even during hardship. Historical economic studies and administrative records show these patterns varying across regions and time, but the recurring logic is familiar. If the empire says it's building, check who owns what gets built. The consequence was a long-term distortion. Economies reorganized around extraction, local resilience weakened, and then, when crisis hit, officials could blame backwardness rather than policy. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the state had another neat way to handle hunger. Make the hungry prove they deserved to eat. Fact 19. Charity could be a test of moral worthiness, not need. Victorian charity is sometimes painted as warm-hearted philanthropy, benevolent ladies, soup kitchens, missions. The setup, help, is offered. The pivot is that help could be structured to deter. Relief might require sermons, public cues, invasive questions, or demonstrations of respectability. If you looked too rough, if you sounded too angry, if you couldn't tell the right story about your misfortune, you might be denied. The revelation is that charity often worked like a gatekeeping system. It sorted the poor into categories, deserving, undeserving, based on behavior that poverty itself made hard. Contemporary charitable literature and reports show the obsession with moral reform. Hunger wasn't just a stomach problem, it was a character problem to be corrected. The consequence was humiliation as policy. And humiliation has a side effect. It trains people to hide, to lie, to disappear, which makes the poor easier to ignore until they become impossible to ignore. And speaking of being impossible to ignore, some workers did what the system feared most. They refused. Fact 20. Strikes were treated as disorder, even when they were survival. When workers struck in the 19th century, they were often demanding the basics: wages that kept pace with bread prices, hours that didn't destroy their bodies, conditions that didn't kill them. The setup should be simple: negotiation. The pivot is how easily strikes were framed as threats to public order. Authorities could deploy police, call in troops, arrest leaders, and use laws against conspiracy or intimidation. Employers could bring in strikebreakers. Newspapers could paint workers as mobs. The revelation is that the industrial economy depended on the idea that labour should be predictable and obedient, like a machine part. When unrest erupted, official language often blamed agitators, as if hunger needed a pamphlet to exist. The consequence was a cycle. Desperation leads to protest. Protest leads to repression. Repression leads to deeper bitterness. And here's the dark joke. Britain celebrated liberty while keeping a close eye on who exactly was allowed to use it. Meanwhile, one of the most profitable British systems of all was so vast that school lessons often treat it like weather. It just happened. It didn't. People did it. Fact 21. Britain's slavery. Profits didn't vanish. They were reinvested. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and the abolition of slavery in much of the British Empire in the 1830s are often told as moral triumphs. The setup. Britain ends a terrible institution. The pivot is what happened financially. When slavery was abolished in 1833, with implementation following, the British state compensated slave owners for the loss of enslaved people as property. The enslaved were not compensated for generations of stolen labour. The revelation is that emancipation was, in part, a managed transition designed to protect wealth. Those payouts and the accumulated profits of slavery didn't evaporate. They flowed into banks, estates, industrial ventures, and political influence. Scholars have traced how slavery's financial legacy threaded into Britain's development, complex, debated in details, but undeniable in scale. The consequence is that abolition, while essential, did not equal justice. It changed the legal status without automatically redistributing the spoils. And speaking of spoils, after slavery, coercion didn't end. It changed outfits. Fact 22. Apprenticeship. After emancipation could function like delayed freedom, after the abolition law, many formerly enslaved people were placed into an apprenticeship system, sold as a transitional arrangement. The setup sounded reasonable to officials: gradual change, stability, time for plantations to adjust. The pivot is that, in practice, it often meant continued forced labour under new rules. People were still compelled to work for former enslavers for set hours, under supervision, with punishments and constraints that kept power in familiar hands. The revelation is the shape-shifting skill of oppressive systems. When one form becomes politically unacceptable, it mutates into another form that can be defended with bureaucratic language. Contemporary reports, colonial correspondence, and abolitionist criticism show fierce debates about how apprenticeship operated and how quickly it should end. Pressure and resistance helped bring the system down earlier than originally planned in many areas. The consequence was a reminder written into the timeline. Freedom was not handed over cleanly. It was negotiated, fought for, delayed, and diluted. And speaking of dilution, Britain's cities diluted something else with remarkable consistency: accountability for preventable death. Fact 23. Industrial accidents were often treated as bad luck, not bad systems. Factories, railways, mines. Britain's modern world was built fast. The setup was new machines, new speed, new power. The pivot is how casually injury and death could be treated as the cost. Early industrial workplaces often lacked guards, safe procedures, or anything resembling modern regulation. People lost limbs to gears, were crushed by equipment, mangled on rail lines. Mine explosions and collapses killed in bulk. Newspaper reports could be both sensational and numbingly routine. Another disaster, another list of names. The revelation is that responsibility was slippery. Owners could blame workers for carelessness. Foremen could blame bad luck. The state could mourn while hesitating to regulate. Meanwhile, widows and children dealt with the aftermath. Over time, reforms emerged: inspection regimes, safety laws, compensation ideas, but they arrived late and unevenly. The consequence is that industrial Britain normalised a level of workplace death that would be considered a national scandal today. And if you're thinking, surely the law stepped in, remember, the law often stepped in hardest when someone tried to change the system, not when the system chewed someone up. Fact 24. Newspapers sometimes made the poor sound like a species, not people. Victorian Britain invented modern mass media. The setup: newspapers inform the public. The pivot is that they also trained the public to see poverty through a lens of suspicion, fear, and moral judgment. Reporting on slums and crime could slide into language that made the poor sound inherently dangerous. Roughs, rabble, the residuum. Stories could frame hardship as the product of laziness, vice, or defective character. The revelation is that this wasn't merely prejudice, it was social management. If the poor are portrayed as a threat, then harsh policing feels like protection rather than oppression. This wasn't universal. Some journalists exposed injustice with real empathy, but the broader pattern mattered. It shaped what middle-class readers believed they were funding through taxes and what they felt justified ignoring. The consequence was a cultural permission slip. Once you dehumanize people in print, it becomes easier to punish them in law. And speaking of punishment, Britain had a chilling way to make sure even death couldn't be a private event. Fact 25. Execution. Day was entertainment until it became embarrassing. Public executions were once a normal feature of British life. The setup was solemn justice. The law carried out its sentence. The pivot is the crowd. Massive, noisy, sometimes festive. People travelled to see hangings. Vendors sold food. Children watched. It was a day out with a corpse at the end. Authorities claimed it deterred crime. Critics argued it brutalized the public and turned suffering into spectacle. The revelation is that the state's moral theatre was also the people's carnival, and neither side seemed especially troubled by that contradiction for a long time. Over the 19th century, Britain moved executions behind prison walls, not necessarily because the act became more morally troubling, but because public spectacle became politically uncomfortable. An image problem for a nation that wanted to look refined. The consequence is a familiar one. Violence didn't vanish. It simply relocated out of sight, where it could be controlled, sanitized and narrated as necessary. And speaking of sanitized narratives, next we'll enter the parts of British history where the official story gets very clean, very heroic, and very selective. Fact 26. Heroic. Exploration often hid a business plan in a flag. The school version of exploration is all courage and curiosity. Men in boots, maps unrolled, noble speeches to the horizon. The setup. Britain discovers, charts, and opens up the world, except the flag often arrived with ledgers. Many expeditions were tangled with commercial or strategic aims. Securing routes, identifying resources, establishing influence before rival powers could. The revelation is that exploration frequently functioned as reconnaissance, an advance scout for empire and investors. When a coastline was mapped, it became easier to claim. When a river was navigated, it became easier to control. When a region was described as empty or underused, it became easier to justify taking it. Contemporary reports, company papers, and government correspondence show how often profit sat quietly beside science. Even when individuals were sincerely driven by curiosity, the machinery around them knew how to convert knowledge into leverage. The consequence is that heroic stories can work like camouflage. They make the process feel romantic, which is convenient when the romance is followed by taxation, land seizure, and coerced labour. And speaking of camouflage, Britain also perfected a domestic version, laws that sounded like moral hygiene but operated like social control. Fact 27. Obscenity. Laws could target politics as much as pornography. Victorian Britain was anxious about morality. The setup for obscenity law is obvious. Protect the public from indecent material. The pivot is how flexible obscenity could be. Once you give authorities power to decide what's corrupting, you give them a tool that can slide towards silencing whatever they find threatening. Radical pamphlets, birth control information, frank discussions of sex and health. The revelation is that moral panic is a reliable wrapper for censorship, because it frames suppression as protection. Court cases and press debates show the tug-of-war. Reformers arguing for public health and education. Authorities invoking decency and social order. It wasn't a single clean narrative, but the pattern is there. Whenever a topic threatens existing power, reproductive autonomy, labour rights, political dissent, it can be rebranded as moral danger. The consequence was a public sphere shaped not only by what people wanted to read, but by what the state allowed to circulate without punishment. Meanwhile, for the people who couldn't afford books, the state had a different kind of literacy lesson. Learn your place. Fact 28. Ragged schools helped children but also trained them for obedience. Ragged schools were created to educate poor children who were otherwise excluded. The setup looks like pure benevolence, basic literacy, meals, shelter from the street. The pivot is that education in Victorian Britain often came with a moral programme attached. Many ragged schools were linked to religious missions and middle-class reformers who believed poverty was partly a failure of character. So lessons could blend reading with discipline, sermons and training for low-wage labour. The revelation is that even help can carry an agenda, teaching children to accept their station as natural. That doesn't erase the genuine good, Many children gained skills and stability, but the system's underlying assumption mattered. The goal was often to produce compliant workers, not empowered citizens. The consequence is subtle. It shaped expectations. What kinds of futures were considered realistic for the poor? Literacy was permitted, but ambition was policed. And speaking of policing ambition, Britain's cities developed an entire architecture of control, where the line between safety and surveillance was always negotiable. Fact 29. The modern police force was built to manage the poor first. When modern policing took shape in the 19th century, the setup was public protection, prevent crime, keep streets safe. The pivot is who got watched most closely. In practice, policing often focused on working-class districts, on visible poverty, on street markets, on anything that looked disorderly. That wasn't an accident. The revelation is that order was defined by those who had property to protect. The new police weren't just chasing thieves, they were enforcing a social boundary between respectable life and desperate life. Contemporary criticism of police power existed. People feared state intrusion, but over time the idea settled, the policeman as everyday authority, a walking reminder that the poor were being observed. The consequence was a familiar imbalance. Some communities experienced the state primarily as a uniform telling them to move along. And speaking of move along, Britain's elites also wanted the poor moved out of certain spaces entirely. Fact 30. Slum clearance could mean displacement, not improvement. Victorian reformers increasingly talked about slums as a disease, something to be cut out. The setup: clear the worst housing, build better, improve health. The pivot is what often happened next. Slum clearance could destroy communities without providing affordable alternatives. People were pushed into other overcrowded areas, rents rose, and new developments could cater to those with money. The revelation is that improvement projects sometimes improved the city's image more than the residents' lives. Local government records and social surveys show the tension. Reformers genuinely appalled by conditions, landlords fighting for profit, officials balancing budgets, and families caught in the middle. Even when new housing was built, it could be too expensive for those displaced. The consequence was a city that learned a cynical trick. You can reduce visible poverty by moving it, not solving it. And speaking of visibility, some of Britain's most brutal practices were almost invisible at home because they happened far away, under the bright moral language of civilizing missions. Fact 31. Famines in the empire were often managed like accounting problems. Famines are often treated like natural disasters. The setup: drought, crop failure, tragedy beyond control. The pivot is policy. In parts of the British Empire, especially in the 19th century, famine relief could be constrained by economic ideology, a fear of dependency, commitment to market principles, reluctance to interfere with grain trade, and obsession with balanced budgets. The revelation is that when officials treat food as a commodity first and a lifeline second, people die in patterns that aren't random. Historical records and scholarly debates show complexity. Different regions, different administrators, different outcomes. But a recurring theme appears in correspondence and policy. Relief was often conditional, limited, or delayed. Sometimes grain was exported from famine areas. Sometimes work tests forced starving people to labor for food. Sometimes local warnings were ignored because acknowledging crisis meant political embarrassment. The consequence was mass death that could be explained away as misfortune until you read the paperwork and see choices. And speaking of paperwork, the empire also ran on lists, categories, and measurements that turned humans into manageable units. Fact 32. Censuses and racial categories were tools of control as much as knowledge. A census sounds neutral. The setup: gather data, understand the population, plan services. The pivot is what classification does in an imperial context. In many colonies, censuses and administrative categories helped authorities map communities, assign identities, and enforce hierarchies. The revelation is that once the state labels you, that label can shape taxation, labor demands, political representation, and social status. Categories that were fluid on the ground could become rigid on paper. This wasn't only about race, it could be about caste, tribe, religion, language, whatever helped administration. But the long-term consequence was that identity could harden into bureaucracy, and bureaucracy could harden into conflict. And speaking of hardened lines, Britain's domestic class lines were enforced not just by policing, but by hunger itself. Fact 33. Bread prices could decide whether a city stayed calm or exploded. When food prices rose sharply, the working poor didn't just feel discomfort. They faced starvation. The setup, grain shortages, bad harvests, wartime disruption. The pivot is that bread riots weren't irrational mob behaviour. They were often a form of desperate negotiation. Crowds sometimes targeted grain merchants, mills, or bakers, not to loot randomly, but to force fair prices. There are records of rioters setting prices and insisting goods be sold at what they considered just rates. The revelation is that the poor understood the market very well. They just didn't accept that the market should be allowed to kill them. Authorities often responded with force, prosecutions, and moral condemnation. But the consequence of ignoring food insecurity was instability. Hunger is political. It always has been. And speaking of political hunger, some of the most famous British reforms came only after the state watched cities shake and realised the ground was moving. Fact 34. The right to vote expanded when elites feared what happened if it didn't. British political reform is often framed as a steady moral evolution. The setup, society becomes more enlightened. Rights expand naturally. The pivot is pressure. Reform Acts in the 19th century broadened the electorate, but they were shaped by fear of unrest, by public agitation, and by elite calculation about preserving stability. The revelation is that power rarely gives itself away because it suddenly feels generous. It yields when the cost of refusing becomes higher than the cost of conceding. Petitions, demonstrations, political unions, radical papers, these were the engine, and they were often met with repression before they were met with compromise. The consequence is that peaceful progress is sometimes a polished memory applied to a rough reality. And speaking of polished memory, Britain's wars are often presented as heroic unity, but behind the flags were systems that treated some lives as cheaper than others. Fact 35. The Navy's press gangs could turn freedom into a technicality. The Royal Navy is a pillar of British identity. The setup, brave sailors, wooden ships, national defence. The pivot is recruitment. For centuries, the Navy used impressment. Press gangs could seize men and force them into naval service, especially during wartime. The revelation is that the state could treat your body as national property if it needed manpower badly enough. Impressment wasn't random chaos. It had rules, exemptions, and bureaucracy. But the lived reality could be violent and arbitrary. Men were dragged from ports, taverns, sometimes even from their workplaces. Resistance could mean beatings, imprisonment, worse. The consequence was a deep contradiction, a nation praising liberty while compelling service by force. It also fueled resentment and fear, especially among working-class communities for whom a press gang was not a romantic legend, but a real danger. Meanwhile, if the state couldn't grab your body directly, it could still control your labour indirectly, through hunger, housing, and law. Fact 36. Enclosure turned common land into private wealth. On a massive scale, imagine a village where common land provides grazing, firewood, and survival, an informal safety net. The setup, shared resources, traditional rights. The pivot is enclosure. Over centuries, but especially intensifying in the 18th and early 19th centuries, common lands were enclosed, fenced, reorganised and converted into private property through acts of parliament and local processes. The revelation is that enclosure wasn't just efficiency, it was a transfer of wealth and power. Those who benefited were often landlords and larger farmers, Those who lost were smallholders and the landless, who relied on common rights to supplement meagre income. Historical records show disputes, petitions, and the slow erosion of customary access. The consequence was rural displacement and urban migration. People pushed toward towns and industrial work. Enclosure helped feed Britain's economic transformation, but it did so by removing option. When the commons vanish, dependence grows. And speaking of dependence, Britain developed a whole moral language to justify why some people should be dependent and grateful, rather than equal and angry. Fact 37. Deserving versus undeserving. Poor was a convenient fantasy. Victorian social policy loved categories. The setup: some people are poor through misfortune, others through vice. The pivot is that the categories were often invented by those who weren't starving. The revelation is how useful the distinction was. It allowed society to feel compassionate without being obligated. You could help the deserving poor, widows, the disabled, the elderly, while blaming the able-bodied unemployed for systemic job shortages, low wages, and economic cycles. Charitable reports, political speeches, and public debates show how often this moral sorting was used. It shaped relief policies, workhouse rules, and everyday cruelty. And it ignored a simple reality: poverty is not a personality type. The consequence is a social permission structure, an excuse to punish people for their hardship while calling it responsibility. And speaking of responsibility, let's talk about what happened when people tried to stop being punished quietly and started organizing loudly. Fact 38. Chartism was a mass democratic movement, and the state treated it like a threat. Chartism is often a footnote in school lessons. The setup: working men ask for political reforms, the People's Charter including broader suffrage and fairer representation. The pivot is the scale. Chartism was one of the largest mass movements in 19th century Britain. It organized meetings, petitions with huge numbers of signatures, newspapers and networks. The revelation is that this wasn't fringe agitation. It was a national demand for democracy from people excluded by design. Authorities responded with surveillance, arrests, and sometimes military force. Leaders were imprisoned. Meetings were monitored. The state feared that political inclusion might arrive through upheaval rather than polite debate. The movement didn't achieve all its aims immediately, but many of its demands eventually became law over the long run. The consequence is that democratic change came from pressure below, not just enlightened generosity above. Meanwhile, Britain had another machine for controlling speech and thought: the courtroom. Fact 39. Libel laws could be used to protect the powerful from public scrutiny. Libel is meant to protect reputations. The setup is sensible: stop people from spreading harmful lies. The pivot is that, historically, libel law could become a shield for the powerful. Publishing accusations against influential figures could bring legal ruin. Newspapers could be prosecuted, bankrupted, or intimidated. The revelation is that truth wasn't always a safe defense in practice, especially when costs and influence mattered. Even the threat of legal action could silence criticism. This shaped what could be said publicly about corruption, abuse, and exploitation. It didn't stop scandal, it just controlled who had the risk tolerance to report it. The consequence is that freedom of the press lived inside a cage of financial vulnerability. One more reminder that rights often belong most securely to those who can afford them. And speaking of cages, Britain perfected institutions that were cages by another name, even for children. Fact 40. Industrial schools and reformatories could criminalise childhood poverty. When we think of juvenile justice, we imagine separate systems and protection. The setup in Victorian Britain was different. Poor children were often treated as potential criminals simply for being poor. Industrial schools and reformatories were designed to remove children from the streets, train them, and prevent crime. The pivot is that admission could be tied to vagrancy, petty offences, or even just being deemed at risk. Categories so broad they could swallow a child who simply lacked supervision because their parents were working. The revelation is that the system blurred care and punishment. Children could be confined, disciplined, and moulded into obedience, often with harsh regimes. Some institutions genuinely improved lives, others were abusive. Records and investigations reveal both. The consequence was that poverty became predictive policing. The state wasn't just reacting to crime, it was intervening in childhood itself, with the assumption that the poor child's natural trajectory was deviance unless corrected. And speaking of correction, Britain's moral obsession didn't stop at discipline. It extended into the body, especially women's bodies. Fact 41. Fallen women institutions could be rescue and control at once. Victorian society had a category called fallen women, a phrase that sounds like a moral trapdoor. The setup: rescue women from prostitution or sexual immorality, offer rehabilitation. The pivot is how rescue could look like confinement. Homes and refugees often imposed strict discipline, religious instruction, and hard labour. Women might be pressured into domestic service placements, separated from children, or kept under tight supervision. The revelation is that society wanted women reformed, but also invisible, removed from streets and respectable sightlines. Some women sought refuge voluntarily, desperate for safety. Others were coerced by courts, families, or circumstance. The line between help and punishment could be thin enough to vanish. The consequence was a gendered system where men's sexual demand was often treated as a given, while women's survival strategies were treated as moral collapse, requiring correction. Meanwhile, the state had another way to control women: medicine backed by law. Fact 42. Contagious disease. Laws could turn women into suspects by default. In the 19th century, fears about sexually transmitted infections, especially among soldiers and sailors, sparked a state response. The setup was public health: protect the armed forces, reduce disease. The pivot is who bore the burden. Contagious Diseases Acts allowed for the detention and forced medical examination of women suspected of prostitution in certain areas. Suspicion could be enough. Men were not subjected to the same regime. The revelation is a familiar pattern. When the state wants to manage a problem connected to male behavior, it often polices women instead. Campaigners fought back. Most famously, organized feminist activism challenged the laws as unjust and abusive. The acts were eventually suspended and repealed, but the consequence lingered. The precedent that women's bodies could be inspected, confined, and regulated for the greater good, with minimal proof and maximal humiliation. And speaking of humiliation, Britain also had an obsession with cleanliness that could slide into cruelty. Fact 43. Public health sometimes meant clearing people, not curing conditions. Victorian reformers discovered sanitation. The setup: prevent disease, improve living standards. The pivot is that health policies could become tools of social engineering. Inspections of housing, regulations on lodging, and improvement schemes sometimes targeted the poor, as if they were the source of contagion rather than victims of neglect. The revelation is that officials could treat poverty itself as a kind of pollution, something to be removed from respectable districts. This could lead to forced moves, crackdowns on informal housing, and criminalisation of those who couldn't meet standards because they lacked money. Instead of building enough affordable housing, cities sometimes punished the poor for living where the city had left them to live. The consequence is an ugly paradox. Public health advances were real and life-saving, but the method sometimes reinforced class power: health for some, discipline for others. And speaking of discipline, Britain's elite schools trained leadership with a kind of controlled brutality that they later romanticized. Fact 44. Public schools normalized violence as character building. When you hear public school in Britain, think elite private boarding schools, Eton, Harrow, Rugby. The setup is tradition, education for the ruling class. The pivot is the culture. In the 19th century, these schools were often places of harsh discipline, bullying, and an internal hierarchy enforced by older boys. Corporal punishment was normal. The revelation is that the men who later ran the empire and governed the state were trained in institutions where dominance was routine and empathy was optional. Some reformers inside these schools tried to change them, and experiences varied, but the broader pattern fed a particular type of leadership style: stoic, authoritarian, comfortable with suffering as necessary. The consequence wasn't just personal trauma, it was a cultural export. The values learned in those corridors could be carried into administration, military command, and colonial governance, where discipline often meant coercion. And speaking of coercion, Britain didn't just govern with laws. It governed with hunger, tied to wages, tied to time. Fact 45. Time discipline was a form of power, and factories enforced it like religion. Before industrialization, many workers lived by task and season. The setup, work, expands and contracts naturally. The pivot is the factory clock. Industrial employers needed punctuality, synchronization, and predictable output. The revelation is that time became a weapon. Bells, clocks, fines for lateness, locked gates. Factories enforced time discipline with a moral edge, portraying punctuality as virtue and lateness as sin. Even when people lived far away, worked multiple jobs, or had children to manage, this wasn't merely efficiency, it restructured life. Meals, sleep, family routines around industrial needs. The consequence was that the employer's schedule colonized the worker's day. And speaking of colonization, Britain also colonized imagination, teaching people to see empire as inevitable and even kind. Fact 46. Children's books and school lessons sold empire as a moral adventure. British children grew up with stories of brave explorers, loyal soldiers, and grateful natives. The setup, educational entertainment. The pivot is propaganda by comfort. The revelation is that empire wasn't only enforced by guns and taxes, it was normalized by narrative. Picture books, school readers, adventure novels. Many presented British rule as benevolent, civilizing, almost parental. Violence was minimized or justified. Resistance was framed as savagery. Extraction became trade. Conquest became order. This mattered because it shaped what future voters and administrators believed was normal. If you grow up thinking your country's power is inherently virtuous, you don't question the receipts. The consequence is generational. Stories become assumptions. Assumptions become policy, and policy becomes reality for people who never agreed to the story. Meanwhile, back home, Britain's own poor were being narrated as a threat, again, and the city responded with architecture designed to keep them moving, never settling. Fact 47. Hostel architecture has deep roots in the idea that rest is a privilege. Modern hostel architecture, spikes, divided benches, feels like a contemporary cruelty. The setup is design choices. The pivot is that the impulse is old. Victorian cities used policing and regulation to push the poor out of certain spaces. Parks had rules. Loitering was targeted. Benches and public spaces were treated as moral stages where the wrong bodies were unwelcome. The revelation is that public space has always been contested. Who gets to sit? Who gets to sleep? Who gets to exist without paying? You can trace the logic through bylaws, policing practices, and social commentary. The consequence is continuity. When society refuses to provide shelter, it often also refuses to allow rest. And speaking of refusing, Britain refused to let some communities exist on their own terms, especially in Ireland, where policy and power left scars that still ache. Fact 48. Ireland's history under British rule includes systemic dispossession. Any brief treatment risks flattening a complex story, but some facts are not optional. The setup often given is political union, shared monarchy, integration. The pivot is dispossession. Land ownership patterns, penal restrictions at various times, and the dominance of landlordism created deep inequality. In the 19th century, the Great Famine was catastrophic, caused by potato blight, yes, but shaped by political economy, land structures, and the realities of who controlled food and rent. The revelation is that famine in a governed land is never purely natural. It's managed by action, inaction, ideology and power. Contemporary accounts describe eviction, hunger, emigration and death. The long-term consequence was demographic transformation, trauma, and a politics sharpened by grief. And speaking of grief, Britain has a habit of turning tragedies into morality plays where the poor are blamed for their own suffering. Fact 49. Temperance. Campaigns sometimes blamed alcohol for poverty instead of wages and rents. Alcohol was real, and addiction was real. The setup, temperance movements sought to reduce harm, protect families and improve health. The pivot is how the narrative could be used. Temperance rhetoric sometimes framed poverty as the product of working-class vice, drink as the root cause, while ignoring structural issues, low pay, unsafe work, overcrowded housing, lack of medical care. The revelation is that moral explanations are politically convenient. If poverty is caused by bad habits, then the state doesn't have to change the economy. This wasn't the whole movement. Many temperance advocates genuinely cared about suffering, but the consequence of the framing mattered. It shifted blame downward. And speaking of blame, when disease hit, the poor were blamed for being dirty, even when the city gave them no tools to be clean. Fact 50. Baths and washhouses were reforms, but also evidence of how little was provided before public baths and washhouses were introduced in the 19th century to improve hygiene. The setup, a progressive step. The pivot is what their popularity revealed. If people flock to washhouses, it's because they lacked basic facilities at home. Overcrowded housing, shared pumps, limited water access, these made cleanliness difficult. The revelation is that moral lectures about cleanliness were often delivered to people living in conditions that practically prevented it. Reformers sometimes understood this. Others treated washing as a moral test. If the poor would just scrub themselves, perhaps they would become respectable. The consequence was a strange social performance. Cleanliness as both health measure and class marker. And speaking of markers, class was marked on the body in another way too, through food that kept you alive but not necessarily healthy. Fact 51. Tea and bread diets kept workers going but also kept them weak. Tea became a staple across Britain. The setup, comfort, culture, a national ritual. The pivot is economic necessity. For many working-class families, tea with bread, or tea with a bit of sugar, was a cheap way to blunt hunger and keep energy up. It was accessible, quick, and emotionally soothing. The revelation is that national habits often grow from hardship. Tea isn't just taste, it's survival strategy, but diets heavy in cheap carbohydrates and low in protein and fresh produce could contribute to malnutrition and poor health. Doctors and social investigators wrote about stunted growth, rickets and chronic weakness, bodies shaped by the price of food. The consequence is that poverty doesn't only mean hunger, it means long-term physical cost passed through generations. And speaking of generations, some children weren't just working, they were being trained to work in ways that looked suspiciously like exploitation wearing a uniform. Fact 52. Apprenticeship could be a pipeline from workhouse to factory. Apprenticeship sounds respectable. Skills, mentorship, a trade. The setup, a route out of poverty. The pivot is how it could function for pauper children. Workhouse authorities could bind children out as apprentices to employers, sometimes far from home, with limited oversight. The revelation is that this could supply cheap labour to industries and trades under the language of training. Some apprenticeships were genuine. Others were brutal arrangements where children were overworked, underfed, and effectively trapped. Reports and investigations occasionally exposed abuses, but the system structure made exploitation easy. Poor children had little power, and their guardians were institutions concerned with cost. The consequence was that opportunity could be another word for extraction, and the children involved learned early that the state's idea of care often came with an invoice. Meanwhile, Britain's legal system had its own extraction mechanism, punishments that generated revenue. Fact 53. Fines and fees could turn the poor into a funding stream. Even minor offences could result in fine. The setup, Deterrence, accountability. The pivot is that fines punish poverty more than wrongdoing. If you're poor, a small fine can be catastrophic. If you can't pay, the system can escalate. Imprisonment, harder labor, more fees. The revelation is that justice can become a financial trap. The poorer you are, the more punishment multiplies. Historical court systems often relied on fees and local funding mechanisms that encouraged this. The consequence is a kind of economic predation disguised as law, the state extracting money from those who have the least and then punishing them for not producing it. And speaking of production, Britain's industrial economy loved things that could be measured, timed, and disciplined. Human breath was not one of them, which is why certain diseases spread like wildfire in the places people worked and slept. Fact 54. Tuberculosis thrived in overcrowded housing, and it was common enough to seem normal. Tuberculosis was known as consumption, romanticized in art, feared in life. The setup, a tragic illness, pale poets, delicate decline. The pivot is that for the poor it was less romance and more relentless arithmetic. Overcrowding, damp housing, poor nutrition, and exhausting labor created perfect conditions for TB to spread and weaken bodies. The revelation is that disease was not an equal opportunity killer. It was amplified by living conditions shaped by wages and rent. Doctors, social investigators, and public health records describe the scale. Families could lose multiple members. Children could be orphaned. And yet, society often treated it as a sad background fact, like fog. The consequence is that when death becomes common, it becomes politically quiet. And quiet death is easy for governments to tolerate. If you think that was bleak, remember, some deaths were not quiet at all. They were deliberate, and they were justified as discipline. Fact 55. Brutality. In the army was routinized as a tool of control. The British Army is often narrated through victory and sacrifice. The setup, brave soldiers, national defence. The pivot is internal discipline. Flogging was used in the Army and Navy for a long time, sometimes severely. The revelation is that the state maintained order in its own ranks through pain, public humiliation, and fear. This wasn't limited to wartime desperation. It was a cultural norm tied to ideas about masculinity and obedience. Contemporary debate existed. Critics called it barbaric. Supporters claimed it was necessary. Over time, reforms reduced and ended such practices, but the consequence remains. When we romanticize military history, we often edit out how the institution treated its own men. And speaking of editing, Britain's national story loves to edit out the parts where law and order looked an awful lot like class warfare. Fact 56. The Black Act made poaching a capital crime in the name of order. In the early 18th century, Britain's elites were obsessed with property, especially land, forests, and game. The setup sounds almost quaint. Deer in royal parks, rabbits on estates, gentlemen protecting their sport. The pivot is how violently the state protected that privilege. The Black Act of 1723 expanded the list of capital offences dramatically. Targeting, blacking the face, and other acts associated with poaching and resistance in the countryside. The revelation is that poaching wasn't treated as hunger or trespass. It was framed as rebellion. Masked men taking deer were imagined as a threat to the social order itself, and the law responded accordingly. Hangings, severe penalties, sweeping powers. Contemporary legal records and parliamentary thinking show the anxiety underneath. Rural unrest, resentment toward landlords, fear of organized resistance, these were the real fuel. The law wasn't just about animals. It was about reminding the poor that even the forest belonged to someone above them. The consequence was a legal landscape where survival strategies could be punished like treason, and it set a tone that lasted. When the powerful feel insecure, they criminalize whatever makes the poor slightly less obedient. And speaking of obedience, Britain also had a way of turning basic leisure into a suspicious act, especially if you were poor and outdoors. Fact 57. Loitering was a crime because poverty looked like a threat. Loitering sounds harmless, standing around, waiting, watching life pass. The setup in many British towns was simple. Public space exists, people use it. The pivot is that public space was never equally public. If you were poor, unemployed, or simply not moving with purpose, you could be treated as suspicious. Laws and bylaws aimed at vagrancy, public nuisance, and disorderly conduct gave authorities broad discretion. The revelation is that loitering often functioned as a proxy charge, a way to police presence when you couldn't legally police poverty directly, except of course Britain often did both. Newspaper reports and court proceedings show how everyday behaviour could become a charge, particularly in areas where respectable shoppers and wealthy residents didn't want reminders of hardship. Move on became policy, not advice. The consequence was a city where the poor were constantly displaced, never allowed to settle long enough to be seen as normal. It also trained communities to internalize shame. If standing still is suspicious, you learn to disappear. Meanwhile, when the poor couldn't disappear, Britain offered them entertainment, sometimes as a distraction, sometimes as a mirror, and occasionally as a cage. Fact 58. The music hall mocked poverty while feeding off it. Victorian music halls were loud, funny, and wildly popular. The setup, working-class entertainment, jokes, songs, escape from hardship. The pivot is the kind of escape being sold. Music hall culture often played with stereotypes of poverty, drunkenness, scrounging, domestic chaos, turning lived suffering into comedy. The revelation is that laughter can be both relief and control. If hardship is a punchline, it's easier to accept it as normal. And if the poor laugh at themselves on stage, the respectable classes can watch without guilt. This wasn't all cruelty. Music halls also carried subversive humour, political commentary, and a sense of shared community. But the pattern mattered. The culture industry could profit from the aesthetics of the slum while leaving the slum intact. The consequence was a nation that learned to find charm in deprivation. It's a neat trick. Make misery entertaining enough, and people stop demanding change. And speaking of demanding change, when women demanded rights, Britain often treated them like a public disturbance that needed to be managed, not a political argument that needed to be answered. Fact 59. Suffragettes were force-fed because the state couldn't afford them dying. The setup is famous. Women demand the vote, protest escalates, arrests follow. The pivot is what happens when imprisoned suffragettes refused food. Hunger strikes were a weapon of moral pressure. If you imprison someone for political protest and they starve, your legitimacy bleeds out with them. The revelation is that the state responded not with concession, but with control, force-feeding. Accounts from the period describe the brutality, restraints, tubes forced into the nose or mouth, pain, vomiting, trauma. The official justification leaned on care, as if violence could be reframed as medical assistance. But the underlying logic was political. Keep them alive, keep them contained, keep them from becoming martyrs. Public controversy was intense. It fed sympathy for the movement, even among those uneasy with militant tactics. Eventually, the state introduced measures like temporary release for weakened hunger strikers. Again, not mercy, but strategy. The consequence is one of the clearest examples of the system's priorities. Order first, dignity last, and survival only when it served the state's image. And speaking of image, Britain was also an empire that cared deeply about how it looked in paintings, exhibitions, and newspapers, even while it did things that didn't photograph well. Fact 60. World fairs and exhibitions sold a clean empire, not a true one. The Great Exhibition of 1851 and the culture of imperial exhibitions offered the setup. Wonder, invention, progress, the world gathered under glass and iron. The pivot is what was curated out. Exhibitions celebrated industry and empire as a triumph of civilization. Raw materials appeared as trophies. Colonies were presented as sources of exotic goods and imperial pride. The revelation is that these displays turned extraction into spectacle and inequality into decoration. Sometimes people from colonized regions were even displayed in ways that reduced them to living exhibits, human presence turned into imperial furniture. Official rhetoric framed this as education and unity, but the underlying message was hierarchy. Britain at the centre, the world arranged around it. Visitors didn't see forced labour contracts, punitive taxation, famine relief debates, or violent suppression. They saw polished objects and patriotic narratives. The consequence was public consent manufactured through awe. When you make power look like progress, criticism feels like spoiling the party. Meanwhile, Britain's progress at home included an obsession with measurement, especially measuring skulls, faces and bodies, then calling the prejudice science. Fact 61. Scientific racism was respectable enough to wear a lab coat. The setup is the 19th century's hunger for classification. Biology, anthropology, museums, measurements. People wanted to explain human difference like they explained plants. The pivot is what that curiosity became. The revelation is that pseudo-scientific ideas about race and hierarchy were not fringe. They could be discussed in respectable circles, published, debated, and used to justify imperial domination and domestic prejudice. Measurements and charts became moral permission slips. If you can claim inequality is natural, then exploitation becomes destiny rather than choice. Not every scientist agreed. Critics existed. The field was contested and messy, but the damage was real because the ideas travelled into policy, education, and public imagination. The language of civilization gained a biological backbone it didn't deserve. The consequence was long-term. Once prejudice borrows the authority of science, it becomes harder to dislodge. It stops being a hateful opinion and starts posing as a fact, until generations later, people have to unpick it like a knot in the national bloodstream. And speaking of national bloodstream, Britain's obsession with purity and control extended into reproduction in ways that were quiet, bureaucratic, and chilling. Fact 62. Eugenic thinking in Britain was real, and it shaped attitudes even without Nazi-style laws. The setup is uncomfortable because it contradicts the self-image of British moderation. Eugenics in Britain often presented itself as rational social improvement. Better health, fewer defects, a stronger nation. The pivot is that improvement was frequently code for controlling who should have children. Eugenic ideas circulated among some intellectuals, reformers, and policy debates in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The revelation is that this wasn't only a foreign horror story, it was part of a broader Western trend where poverty, disability, and degeneracy were treated as hereditary threats rather than social problems. Britain did not implement the same kind of sweeping compulsory sterilization regime seen elsewhere on the same scale, and there was resistance and disagreement. But eugenic thinking still influenced public conversations about welfare, mental health institutions, and fitness. Even without mass legal enforcement, the attitudes shaped how people were treated, who was trusted, who was blamed, who was considered a burden. The consequence is the quiet kind, stigma reinforced by science, policy shaped by fear, and a moral landscape where compassion could be overridden by calculations about the nation's quality. Meanwhile, the poor didn't just face stigma, they faced literal hunger tied to global markets, because the empire was a machine and machines do not care who gets crushed. Fact 63. Britain's global trade could make local hunger worse, not better. Trade is often taught as prosperity. The setup. Ships bring goods, markets distribute resources, wealth grows. The pivot is the vulnerability created by dependence. When local economies are reshaped around export crops or imported staples, hunger can become more likely during shocks. The revelation is that integration into global trade can amplify crisis for the poor, because prices can rise beyond local reach, and food can move toward paying markets rather than starving mouths. This pattern appeared in different ways across Britain and its empire. Urban workers hit by bread price spikes, colonial regions exporting commodities while struggling with subsistence, rural communities losing land to cash crop priorities. The details vary and should be handled carefully. History is not one simple formula, but the consequence repeats. When food is governed primarily by profit logic, relief becomes optional rather than automatic, and the poor learn a brutal truth. The market can stay healthy while people die. And speaking of dying, sometimes Britain's violence was not slow. It was immediate, public, and justified with the word discipline. Fact 64. British punitive expeditions were often collective punishment in practice. The setup is a familiar imperial story. An attack occurs, a rebellion breaks out, a British official is killed, and the empire responds. The pivot is how that response could operate. Punitive expeditions were military actions designed to punish a community or region. Burning villages, destroying crops, seizing livestock, imposing fines, executing or imprisoning suspects. The revelation is that these operations often blurred any line between combatant and civilian. They were meant to be unforgettable lessons. Official language could frame them as restoring order, but order restored through collective punishment tends to produce silence, not consent. Reports and correspondence sometimes reveal the cold calculation, demonstrate power, deter resistance, impose costs so heavy that future defiance feels impossible. The consequence lasted beyond the burned buildings. It embedded fear, resentment, and trauma into local memory, while Britain at home often heard about necessary measures and moved on. And speaking of moving on, Britain also developed an extraordinary ability to mourn its own dead while ignoring the dead produced by its policies. Fact 65. National mourning was selective, and it trained people who deserved grief. When a royal died, Britain could drape itself in black. The setup, unity through mourning, shared identity, ritual. The pivot is whose deaths were treated as background noise. Mass deaths among the poor, workhouse outbreaks, industrial disasters, slum epidemics rarely produced national ritual beyond brief headlines. Death in the empire could be even more distant. Numbers reported, briefly lamented, then folded into the abstract language of disturbances and unfortunate events. The revelation is that mourning is political. It signals who counts. This isn't to deny genuine individual compassion. Many people cared deeply, but the public rituals of grief were uneven, and that unevenness mattered. It shaped what felt urgent and what felt normal. The consequence was a moral economy where certain lives were treated as historically significant and others as disposable. And disposable lives are easier to govern harshly because their suffering doesn't generate a crisis of conscience on the front page. Meanwhile, the front page sometimes focused on a new horror at home, one that became legendary, sensational, and oddly useful. Fact 66. Jack the Ripper became a myth that distracted from the daily violence of poverty. The setup is late 1880s London. Fog, gaslight, East End streets, fear. The Ripper murders became a media frenzy, a national obsession, a dark legend. The pivot is what the obsession obscured. The revelation is that the East End was already a site of slow violence, overcrowding, hunger, exploitative labour, disease, and the vulnerability of women with few options. The murders were extraordinary, but the conditions that made the victims vulnerable were ordinary and politically maintained. Newspapers sold fear and fascination. Letters, some real, some hoaxes, fed the spectacle. The mystery became a cultural product, and the women killed became props in a narrative about a monster, rather than about a city that allowed desperation to fester. The consequence is that Britain remembers the killer more vividly than the structural cruelty that surrounded the killings. It's a pattern. One dramatic villain is easier to digest than a system that produces thousands of quiet tragedies without needing a knife. And speaking of systems, Britain's housing system often turned basic shelter into a tool for discipline. Fact 67. Landlord power could make eviction feel like a natural disaster. The setup is simple. You rent a home, you pay what you can, you try to survive. The pivot is that tenancy security was often weak, and landlord power could be overwhelming. In crowded cities and rural estates alike, Eviction could arrive suddenly and reshape a life overnight. The revelation is that housing insecurity isn't just personal misfortune, it's a power relationship. If you fear eviction, you fear complaining about conditions, you fear organizing, you fear being seen as troublesome. Social investigations and local records describe families forced into lodging houses, into overcrowded rooms, into the workhouse, into the street. Rent could consume huge portions of income. One illness, one lost job, one wage cut, and the household collapsed. The consequence was a population living in a constant state of precariousness, and precarious people are easier to govern. They don't have time to dream about rights. They're too busy negotiating with the next week. Meanwhile, the state found ways to make even private life part of policing, especially in the name of moral improvement. Fact 68. Moral reformers could invasively police working-class homes. Victorian Britain was full of reformers who believed they were saving society. The setup: philanthropic visitors, missions, improvement societies, advice on hygiene and child rearing. The pivot is intrusion. Some reform efforts involved inspecting homes, judging housekeeping, questioning mothers, monitoring behavior. The revelation is that charity could act like surveillance. If you needed help, you might have to open your door to scrutiny. Your kitchen, your bed arrangements, your children's clothing, your habits. Respectability became paperwork. This wasn't always malicious. Some visitors genuinely tried to help families navigate brutal conditions. But the power dynamic mattered. The poor were expected to perform gratitude and accept judgment. Middle-class standards were treated as universal, even when poverty made them impossible. The consequence was psychological as well as material. When survival requires passing a moral test administered by strangers, you learn to live with shame as background noise. And speaking of background noise, Britain's cities were loud, but one sound was particularly constant: the clatter of commerce built on imperial extraction, with tea and sugar as everyday reminders. Fact 69. Sugar and tea were daily luxuries built on violence and coercion. The setup is comforting. A cup of tea, a spoon of sugar, British life distilled into ritual. The pivot is the supply chain. For long periods, sugar production was tied to enslaved labor in the Caribbean and brutal plantation regime. After emancipation, coercive labor systems and exploitative contracts continued in various forms across imperial economies. Tea production, too, became entwined with imperial plantation labor, land control, and harsh working conditions in places where British commercial power shaped local realities. The revelation is that ordinary comfort can be built on extraordinary suffering, so ordinary that consumers rarely question it. That's how these systems survive, not by hiding entirely, but by becoming normal. This doesn't mean every person drinking tea was personally cruel. It means everyday life was plugged into structures of extraction that were politically defended and economically rewarded. The consequence is a national memory that treats empire as distant history, while its products sat on every table, turning violence into a sweetener. And speaking of tables, when the poor sat down to eat, Britain sometimes required them to eat the lesson too. Fact 70. Relief could be tied to punishing routines that broke family life. The setup of poor relief sounds straightforward. If someone can't survive, society provides basic support. The pivot is conditionality, relief shaped to discourage relief. Outside the workhouse, outdoor relief could be restricted or made humiliating. Inside, routines were designed to feel institutional and discouraging. Early rising, hard labor, segregation, strict discipline, limited privacy. The revelation is that welfare wasn't simply a safety net. It was also a behavioral system. It aimed to reshape the poor into something the respectable classes found acceptable: quiet, grateful, and invisible. Families were often disrupted. Children might be separated. Elderly people might be institutionalized. The emotional cost was treated as irrelevant compared to the moral objective: deter dependency. The consequence was a society that built a safety net with barbed wire woven through it. Help existed, but it came with pain. And when help hurts, people delay seeking it until crisis becomes catastrophe. Then officials can point to catastrophe as proof the poor are irresponsible. Meanwhile, catastrophe could also arrive from above in the most literal way. A crowd, a stadium, a collapsed structure. Moments when Britain's mass society revealed how thin the line was between entertainment and disaster. Fact 71. Crowd disasters exposed how cheap working-class safety could be. Mass entertainment in Britain has a comforting myth attached. The crowd as community, the stadium as shared joy, the street as celebration. The setup is collective pride. Thousands gathered for sport, ceremony, or spectacle. The pivot is that crowds became dangerous when planners treated people like pressure, not lives. In the early 20th century, disasters like the 1902 Ibrox Stadium collapse in Glasgow killed and injured large numbers, revealing how quickly excitement can turn into structural failure. Later tragedies, Burnden Park in 1946 and the Hillsborough disaster in 1989, showed something even darker. The deadliest factor wasn't always the crowd itself, but the decisions around it. Gate management, fencing, policing tactics, bottleneck design, delayed medical response, and an official instinct to blame the masses instead of the system. The revelation is that working-class leisure was often treated as inherently disorderly, so control measures were prioritized over safety and dignity. And when catastrophe hit, early narratives could default to blaming the crowd, because blaming architecture and authority is expensive. The consequence was reform bought with bodies. Regulations improved, inquiries happened, but only after families had to fight for truth, sometimes for decades, against convenient official stories. And speaking of official stories, some of Britain's most persistent myths are built on what the state chose not to see. Fact 72. The workhouse infirmary could be a hospital in name and a warehouse in practice. Victorian Britain eventually developed modern medicine, hospitals, and professional nursing. The setup sounds like progress. Illness becomes treatable, care improves. The pivot is where the poorest were treated. Workhouse infirmaries were meant to handle the sick poor, but for much of the 19th century, they were notoriously under-resourced and overcrowded, often staffed by untrained or minimally trained workers. Contemporary reformers documented wards where contagious diseases mixed with chronic illness, where privacy was non-existent and where pain was managed with discipline more than compassion. The revelation is that care could be structured like punishment. If relief is supposed to deter, then even the sick must not find comfort too easily, because comfort might encourage them to seek help again. It's a logic so cruel it tries to make suffering self-regulating. Later reforms did improve many infirmaries, and some became the foundations of municipal hospitals. But that transition itself reveals the truth. The system had to be publicly shamed into acknowledging that illness isn't a moral failing. The consequence is a grim historical echo. Britain built parts of its health system by first letting the poor suffer in institutions designed to make suffering educational. And speaking of education, nothing taught you your place faster than how you were allowed to be buried. Fact 73. Pauper burials turned death into a final class lesson. Death is supposed to level people. The setup in Britain was that the churchyard welcomed everyone. The pivot is that even in death, the poor could be managed like a budget line. Pauper burials were often done quickly, cheaply, and with minimal ceremony. In many places and periods, those who died in workhouses could be buried in communal graves, sometimes without markers, sometimes with families given little control. The revelation isn't just that the poor had less. Everyone knows that. It's that the system could strip away the one thing death usually guarantees: dignity without negotiation. Contemporary criticism and local records show how these practices varied by place, but the moral pattern repeats. If a person dies under the label of pauper, the state often treated their body as a problem to be disposed of efficiently. The consequence is a kind of historical erasure. When graves are unmarked, memory thins. When memory thins, accountability dissolves, and then later the nation can pretend hardship was rare because the evidence has been buried without a name. Meanwhile, the living poor were also at risk of becoming useful, especially to institutions hungry for bodies, data, and progress. Fact 74. Medical progress, sometimes advanced by experimenting on the powerless. Britain's medical history includes genuine heroes, people who reduced infection, improved surgery, and saved lives. The setup is uplifting. Science moves forward. The pivot is consent. In the 18th and 19th centuries and into the 20th, the boundaries of ethical practice were not what they are now. Patients in institutions, workhouses, asylums, prisons, often had less power to refuse treatment, less understanding of what was being done, and fewer advocates to ask hard questions. The revelation is that when society treats some people as disposable, it becomes easier to treat their bodies as available. This isn't a claim that every doctor was a villain or that British medicine was uniquely cruel. It's that the structure of inequality creates a testing ground. The poor and institutionalized become the easiest subject because they can't easily say no in a way that matters. Official inquiries, medical debates, and reform movements over time pushed ethics forward, often after scandals or public disgust. The consequence is the uncomfortable double truth. Progress happened, and some of it was purchased with the suffering of people who were never offered a real choice. And speaking of suffering you couldn't easily refuse, try refusing the air itself. Fact 75. Britain's smog wasn't fog. It was a man-made health disaster. British weather gets blamed for everything. The setup is the romantic London fog, a cultural aesthetic, a Sherlock Holmes backdrop. The pivot is that much of it was smoke. Coal-powered Britain, and that power came with a price that settled in lungs. Industrial pollution and domestic coal fires produced dense smogs that could choke cities, worsen respiratory disease, and shorten lives. The revelation is that people adapted to a poisonous atmosphere as if it were normal, because challenging it meant challenging industry, landlords, and the economics of fuel. The 1952 Great Smog of London was a brutal turning point, a thick, lethal blanket that caused a sharp rise in deaths and forced the state to treat air as a policy issue rather than a joke about weather. It exposed in numbers what had been quietly happening for decades. The consequence was legislation and cleaner fuels over time, but also a reminder that Britain's industrial glory was built not only on labour and empire, but on a public health debt paid by ordinary bodies. And speaking of invisible poisons, some of Britain's most damaging exposures were hiding in plain sight, in pipes and paint and cheap household materials. Fact 76. Lead poisoning lingered in British life long after people suspected. Lead was useful. It made paint durable, pipes workable, glazes glossy. The setup is practical materials in a growing nation. The pivot is what those materials did to brains and bodies. Lead poisoning was known in various forms for centuries, associated with certain trades and exposures, but industrial and domestic use spread risk widely, especially to children whose developing nervous systems are more vulnerable. The revelation is that a society can suspect a hazard and still tolerate it for a long time because changing infrastructure costs money, and the people most harmed have the least leverage. Medical observations and reform arguments did exist, and awareness grew unevenly. Over time, restrictions and replacements reduced risk, but the historical consequence is written into health inequalities. When poor housing contains the worst materials and poor neighbourhoods bear the heaviest industrial exposure, environment becomes a class issue. And speaking of class issues, when the state failed to provide security, ordinary people built their own systems of survival. Fact 77. Mutual aid kept people alive when the state offered shame instead of help. Before modern welfare, working people often relied on each other. The setup is community, friendly societies, burial clubs, mutual aid funds. The pivot is why they were necessary. These organizations helped pay for sickness, funerals, and crises, because losing wages even briefly could destroy a household. The revelation is that Britain's poor didn't just cope. They engineered social insurance from the ground up, often with discipline, rules and contributions that looked remarkably like the welfare state Britain later claimed as a national achievement. Friendly societies could be exclusionary too. Some drew hard lines around respectability, but their existence exposes a truth. The working class understood risk and built solutions long before the state decided it had responsibilities. The consequence is that when politicians later framed welfare as a gift from above, they quietly erased the centuries of mutual aid that proved people weren't morally deficient. They were structurally unsupported. And speaking of structural support, employers also built structures that looked like benefits until you noticed they were cages. Fact 78. The truck system paid workers in goods or tokens to keep them dependent. Imagine working all week and being paid not in cash you can spend anywhere, but in tokens or goods controlled by your employer. The setup was often sold as convenience, company stores, credit, local supply. The pivot is control. The truck system trapped workers inside a private economy. Prices could be inflated. Quality could be poor. Debt could be used to keep people from leaving. The revelation is that this wasn't a quirky old practice. It was a deliberate way to turn wages into dependent, making employment feel less like a contract and more like a leash. Campaigns against truck payments pushed for free labor to mean wages paid in real money. Laws were introduced and strengthened over time to restrict such practices, but the consequence remains instructive. Whenever employers can control not just your wage, but how you can use it, freedom becomes a technicality. Meanwhile, when people lost economic freedom at scale, it didn't always look like a factory. Sometimes it looked like empty villages and sheep. Fact 79. The Highland clearances were not one event, but a long unmaking of community. The romantic setup is tartan and mist, Highland culture as poetry, clans as timeless. The pivot is eviction. Over the 18th and 19th centuries, many Highland communities were cleared from their lands as landlords reorganised estates, often toward sheep farming and other improvements. The details varied by region and landlord, and motivations ranged from profit to ideology to modernisation pressure. But the revelation is that improvement repeatedly meant removing people who had lived on the land for generations. Accounts describe homes burned, communities scattered, and migration, sometimes to coastal crofts, sometimes to lowland cities, sometimes overseas. Not every case was identical, and historians debate emphasis and causation in places. But the human pattern is unmistakable. Power over land translated into power over lives. The consequence is cultural as well as economic. Language, traditions, and community bonds were strained or broken, and later, Britain could package Highland identity as heritage after the people who carried that identity had been forced to leave. And speaking of being forced to leave, Britain also exported children, not just criminals. Fact 80. Child migration schemes sent thousands away, sometimes with lies as paperwork. The setup was benevolence, poor or orphaned children given a fresh start in the colonies, Australia, Canada, and elsewhere, where they could build better lives. The pivot is what fresh start could mean in practice. Child migration schemes operated over long periods, with different organisations involved. Some children did find opportunity, but many experienced harsh labour, exploitation, abuse, and lifelong dislocation. The revelation is that the children's consent was often meaningless or non-existent, and families were sometimes misled or told their children had died. Paperwork could turn separation into policy and trauma into resettlement. Later investigations and apologies in different countries acknowledged harms, and survivors' testimonies revealed how deep the damage ran. The consequence is not just personal tragedy, it's a lesson about how easily saving people becomes a cover story when the people being saved are powerless and far away. And speaking of far away, when Britain's authority felt threatened in the empire, the response could be swift, public, and designed to terrify. Fact 81. The 1857 rebellion in India led to reprisals that revealed empire's real face. The setup is often framed as a mutiny or a rebellion. 1857, a major uprising against the East India Company's rule. The pivot is what followed. Both sides committed violence and it was brutal, but the revelation, from British reprisals documented in accounts and correspondence, is how quickly imperial authority moved toward collective punishment and spectacle. Executions, village punishments, and harsh military responses weren't only about defeating resistance, they were about reasserting dominance, proving that defiance would be answered with overwhelming force. Afterward, rule shifted from the company to the British Crown, sold as reform and stability. Yet the underlying message hardened. The empire would modernize its administration, yes, but it would also fortify its coercive core. The consequence was a deeper mistrust, a sharper political consciousness among colonized peoples, and a long memory of humiliation and violence. Empires don't just occupy land, they occupy future relationships. And speaking of relationships, Britain's domestic order relied on an unspoken bargain. The poor would endure, the rich would reform just enough to keep the peace. Fact 82. Respectability was a social passport and it was expensive by design. Victorian society loved the word respectable. The setup is simple: behave well, work hard, keep clean, and you earn dignity. The pivot is that respectability cost money. Clean clothes, decent housing, stable work, time for family life. These weren't just moral choices, they were economic privileges. The revelation is that the working poor were judged by standards that poverty made difficult to meet. Then that failure was treated as proof. They deserved their hardship. Social investigators wrote about families balancing impossible budgets, making choices between rent and food, boots and coal. A single crisis could collapse respectability, and once lost, it could be hard to regain because employers, landlords and charities often demanded it as an entry ticket. The consequence is a moral trap. Society creates conditions that produce instability, then punishes people for being unstable. It's one of Britain's most enduring tricks, turns structural harm into personal shame. And speaking of shame, Britain's justice system had a particular talent for making punishment feel inevitable, even when it was policy. Fact 83. Prison reform sometimes meant silence and control. Not humanity, prison reform is often told as progress. Fewer public spectacles, more rational systems, rehabilitation. The setup is humane modernity. The pivot is the reality of separate and silent systems. In the 19th century, some prison regimes emphasized isolation, silence, and strict routine. The revelation is that reform could still be cruel, just quieter. Isolation was believed to inspire reflection and repentance. In practice, prolonged solitude could damage mental health, producing despair, hallucinations, and breakdowns. Official reports and prison literature debated effectiveness, and approaches varied. But the broader consequence was that punishment became more psychologically invasive. The body might be less publicly torn, but the mind could be quietly eroded. And once punishment is hidden behind walls, the public can pretend it's orderly. That's the convenience. Suffering out of sight is easier to tolerate. Meanwhile, in the empire, suffering was not always hidden at all. Sometimes it was a message delivered in daylight. Fact 84. Amritsar 1919 showed how order could mean shooting unarmed people. The setup is colonial India after World War I. Tension, protests, a population promised reform and feeling betrayed. In April 1919 in Amritsar, a large crowd gathered at Jallianwala Bagh. The pivot is that British troops under Brigadier General Reginald Dyer fired into the crowd. The exact dynamics and numbers have been argued over historically, but the core event is documented. A massacre of unarmed civilians, followed by intense controversy. The revelation is not just that it happened, but how it was debated afterward. Some condemned it as monstrous, others defended it as necessary to restore authority, treating mass death as a regrettable but acceptable tool. Investigations and political fallout followed, and Dyer became both vilified and celebrated, depending on the audience. That split is the real lesson. Empire trains people to see violence as administrative. The consequence was profound. Intensified anti-colonial anger, shattered illusions about benevolent rule, and a memory that made civilization rhetoric sound like mockery. And speaking of mockery, few events mocked imperial moral claims more than famine managed with ideology. Fact 85. The 1943 Bengal famine wasn't just food shortage. It was policy and power in a crisis. The setup is wartime scarcity, World War II disrupts shipping, Japan advances in Asia, panic spreads, prices rise. Bengal suffers crop disease and shock. The pivot is that famine is never just the absence of food. It's the collapse of access. Scholars debate the relative weight of factors: harvest conditions, wartime logistics, market speculation, administrative failure, and policy decisions. But the revelation is unavoidable. Millions suffered and died in a governed territory, and decisions about shipping, procurement, price control, and relief shaped who lived and who didn't. Contemporary accounts describe starvation in streets, villages emptied, families selling everything, and a bureaucracy struggling, sometimes indifferent, sometimes constrained by ideology and war priority. The moral horror is not only in the death toll, but in the excuses, that interference would distort markets, that resources were needed elsewhere, that crisis could be managed without radical action. The consequence was lasting trauma and political radicalization, and it left a stain on Britain's wartime self-image, because victory stories sound different when you remember who paid for them without ever being in the victory parade. We're well past the point where this is interesting trivia. This is the machinery. Fact 86. Care for the poor sometimes included taking their children away. The setup sounds compassionate. A child in danger, a family in crisis, the state stepping in to protect the vulnerable. And sometimes that is exactly what happened. Except protection has always had a second meaning when poverty is involved. Control. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, poor families could find their children removed or pressured into institutions, training homes, or boarding out arrangements because officials judged the household unfit, often by standards that poverty itself made impossible. Crowded housing became neglect. A mother working long hours became failure of supervision. Hunger became bad character. The revelation is that the state could treat poverty as evidence against parent, rather than evidence against policy. And once a child enters the institutional orbit, workhouse schools, industrial schools, children's homes, the distance between help and harm depends entirely on oversight, funding, and the temperament of whoever holds authority that day. The consequence was lifelong. Family bonds weakened, identities fractured, and many people grew up carrying a private understanding of Britain that never makes it into the patriotic version. The state can love children in speeches while separating them in practice. And speaking of separation, sometimes it wasn't the state directly, sometimes it was an industry. Fact 87. Baby farming turned infant care into a profitable nightmare. Victorian Britain had a problem it didn't like to name. Unwanted or unsupported pregnancies, especially among unmarried women, in a society that offered shame faster than support. The setup was a grim market solution. Pay someone to care for your infant. The pivot is what happens when desperation meets profit and secrecy. So-called baby farming ranged from legitimate informal fostering to outright neglect and murder. Some caregivers took multiple infants for money and provided minimal care, knowing the infants were unlikely to be monitored. The revelation is that the system's moral cruelty created the conditions for literal cruelty. If a mother is too ashamed to be visible, then her child becomes easier to disappear. Cases that surfaced in court and press reports horrified the public. One of the most notorious figures, Amelia Dyer, was convicted in the 1890s for murdering infants placed in her care. An extreme example, but one that revealed the vulnerability built into the arrangement. The consequence was legal change and increased scrutiny, but also a darker lesson. When society refuses to support women and children openly, it creates shadow systems where the worst people thrive. Meanwhile, Britain's shadow systems weren't only private. Some were industrial, embedded into the economy like an unspoken clause. If the job ruins you slowly, that's not a scandal. It's work. Fact 88. Asbestos was useful long after its deadliness was hard to ignore. The setup is industry's favourite word, useful. Asbestos resisted heat, insulated ships and buildings, and seemed like a miracle material in an age obsessed with fireproofing and mass construction. The pivot is that its danger was not a sudden surprise. Over time, medical evidence accumulated linking asbestos exposure to severe lung disease and cancers, including mesothelioma. Workers in shipyards, construction and manufacturing were heavily exposed, often without adequate protection, often without clear warning, often while dust-coated clothes and hair like harmless snow. The revelation is the delay. Even when risk became harder to deny, removal and regulation moved slowly, contested by cost and convenience. And because the worst outcomes can take decades to appear, the harm was easy to postpone politically. The bill arrived later, in hospital wards with people who had done nothing more radical than go to work. The consequence is that industrial progress can create a hidden cemetery that grows over time. And once you notice that, you start seeing the same pattern in the places Britain built quickly, cheaply and proudly, until the structure itself began to complain. Fact 89. Housing solutions sometimes created new disasters for the same people. Britain's 20th century housing story is often told as triumph. Slums cleared, modern estates built, families moved into clean new flats. The setup is progress in concrete form. The pivot is what happens when speed, austerity and cost-cutting become more important than safety. Some high-rise projects and prefabricated systems were built under intense pressure to solve shortages. Failures and near-failures exposed weaknesses, most famously the 1968 Ronan Point collapse in London after a gas explosion, which triggered serious questions about building methods and regulation. The revelation is continuity. Decades later, Britain was still wrestling with how safety is enforced, how social housing is funded, and whose warnings are heard. When tragedy struck in a modern tower block in the 21st century, public shock was intense, but many residents and campaigners had been warning for years about neglect, regulation gaps, and the quiet downgrading of poor people's safety. The consequence is a brutal consistency. The people least able to choose their housing often live with the greatest risk, and risk becomes normal, right up until it becomes headline. And speaking of headlines, there's a quieter story that rarely makes them. The people who were watched and punished not for crimes, but for organising. Fact 90. Workers were blacklisted for trying to protect themselves. The setup is basic democracy. If your workplace is dangerous or unfair, you join a union, you raise issues, you organise. The pivot is retaliation that doesn't need a courtroom. For parts of the 20th century and beyond, blacklisting existed in British industry, especially construction, where workers suspected of union activism or raising safety concerns could find themselves quietly denied jobs across a whole network. The revelation is that you can destroy someone's livelihood without ever charging them with anything. No trial. No formal accusation, just a phone call, a file, a name marked as trouble. Investigations and exposures later revealed how extensive such lists could be and how long they could follow someone. Some workers only discovered years later why employment kept slipping through their fingers, why their families lived on the edge despite experience and skill. The consequence is that safety becomes dangerous to demand. And when safety is dangerous, accidents become more likely, not because workers don't care, but because the system punishes the ones who speak first. If you think that was cynical, remember. Britain also developed deep habits of surveillance, especially when political tension rose, and those habits rarely stayed neatly contained. Fact 91. Security powers expanded fast and rolled back slow. The setup is always urgent: terrorism, unrest, threats to public safety. In those moments, governments promise protection, and the public often agrees to trade some freedom for the feeling of order. The pivot is how sticky emergency powers can become. Across modern British history, especially during times of conflict in Ireland and later during global security panics, surveillance and policing powers expanded, sometimes including detention practices and intelligence operations that sparked fierce debate about rights and accountability. The revelation is that the state is very good at acquiring new powers and much less enthusiastic about relinquishing them once the immediate crisis fades. Official inquiries, legal challenges, and political arguments have repeatedly circled the same question: how do you prevent extraordinary measures from becoming ordinary habits? The consequence is cultural as well as legal. Once a society normalizes being watched just in case, it reshapes what dissent feels like. People self-edit, movements fracture, fear becomes administrative, and speaking of administrative fear, few things are as administrative as an empire trying to crush a rebellion while still calling itself civilized. Fact 92. Britain ran detention camps in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising. The setup is the 1950s Kenya under British colonial rule, with a violent conflict often referred to as the Mau Mau uprising. British officials framed it as a battle against terror and disorder. The pivot is the detention system. Large numbers of Kenyans were detained, interrogated, and forced through screening processes. The revelation, documented through survivor testimony, historical research, and later legal cases, is that abuse and torture occurred within this system, not as a few isolated bad acts, but as patterns that were enabled by policy, pressure, and a belief that certain bodies could be broken for order. For a long time, these histories were minimized in the mainstream British story, treated as awkward colonial footnotes, but the paper trails, the testimonies, and the eventual public reckoning make the reality difficult to dodge. The consequence is a hard truth about endings. Even as the empire was shrinking, the machinery of coercion didn't politely retire. It intensified where power felt threatened. And speaking of threatened power, sometimes Britain's greatest act of violence wasn't a single massacre. It was a rushed line on a map. Fact 93. Partition in 1947 was rushed, and the human cost was catastrophic. The setup is the end of British rule in India. After decades of struggle, the empire leaves and independence arrives. The pivot is speed. Partition in 1947, creating India and Pakistan, happened amid political pressure, communal tensions, and administrative urgency. The revelation is that the process was fast, contested, and insufficiently prepared for the human reality on the ground. Borders cut through communities. Uncertainty spread, violence erupted on a horrific scale, with mass displacement and death. Historians debate responsibility across multiple actors and forces: imperial policy, local leadership, communal dynamics, and the inherited structures of governance. But the uncomfortable point remains. Britain presided over the exit, and the administrative choices, timelines, and boundary decisions shaped the chaos. The consequence is generational trauma, and it's a reminder that decolonization isn't a tidy moral conclusion. It can be an acceleration of danger, delivered with official stamps and exhausted signatures. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the national story liked to say the country was fair-minded and tolerant. The reality was messier, and often written in rental ads and hiring decisions. Fact 94. Discrimination was often open, casual, and completely normalized. The setup in Britain's self-image is decency, rule of law, fair play, gradual progress. The pivot is everyday discrimination that didn't need a law to be effective. In the 20th century, immigrants and minority communities often faced housing and employment barriers, landlords refusing tenants, employers refusing workers, social spaces enforcing informal colour bars. The revelation is that you don't need explicit segregation statutes to create segregated outcomes. You just need enough people willing to say no, and enough institutions willing to treat that no as choice. Some notorious phrases associated with discrimination have been debated in terms of how widely they were literally posted, but the broader reality is not in doubt. Exclusion happened, and it shaped lives, where people could live, what jobs they could get, how safe they felt walking down certain streets. The consequence is that prejudice became structural, without always looking official, and when something is structural, it can survive even after the nation decides it dislikes being called prejudice. And speaking of being called out, few things embarrassed Britain more than proof that the justice system could be bent into producing the right results. Fact 95. Some of Britain's most famous terrorism cases became symbols of miscarriages of justice. The setup is fear, bombings, public panic, political urgency. The state promises security and swift justice. The pivot is what urgency does to truth. In the 1970s, cases connected to IRA bombings led to convictions that later collapsed, most famously the Guildford Four and the Birmingham Six, along with others caught in the same web. The revelation is that the justice system can be pressured into needing answers so badly that it starts treating vulnerable suspects as solutions. False confessions, coercive interrogation, unreliable evidence, and institutional defensiveness played roles in these scandals. As later appeals and investigations revealed, the tragedy isn't only the years stolen from those wrongfully convicted, it's the secondary damage. Real perpetrators remain free longer, public trust erodes, and the system learns the wrong lesson if accountability is avoided. The consequence is a darker understanding of rule of law. It isn't a guarantee. It's a fragile achievement that fails most easily under pressure, and pressure is when you need it most. And speaking of pressure, when families demanded truth from institutions, Britain sometimes responded with a wall of denial sturdy enough to last decades. Fact 96. Official narratives could blame victims first and correct themselves much later. The setup after a tragedy is supposed to be clarity. Investigate, learn, honour the dead. The pivot is institutional self-protection. In multiple British disasters and scandals, early official narratives sometimes lean toward blaming ordinary people, crowds, residents, hooligans, irresponsible tenants, before thoroughly examining decisions made by authorities. The revelation is that institutions often reach for the explanation that costs them least. When families and survivors refuse to accept that, the battle becomes part of the tragedy itself. They fight not just grief, but paperwork, public relations, legal maneuvers, and the slow, grinding refusal to admit wrongdoing. The consequence is that closure becomes a privilege. Some people get monuments and national sympathy. Others get suspicion and a decades-long struggle for recognition. And if you think that's merely modern, remember, Britain has a long tradition of treating certain communities as suspect by default, then acting shocked when the communities demand accountability. Fact 97. Public order. Policing could look like a show of force against working people. The setup is protest, workers striking, communities resisting closures, people trying to defend livelihoods. The pivot is policing strategy. During major industrial conflicts, most famously the 1984-85 miners' strike, policing became a national spectacle. Large deployments, confrontations, and allegations about excessive force and aggressive tactics made clear that the state could mobilize power quickly when the economic order was challenged. Events like the confrontation at Orgreave became symbols, still argued over, still politically charged, still carrying claims of manipulated narratives and disputed accountability. The revelation isn't that policing is always oppressive. It's that policing is never politically neutral when the conflict is about who gets to control the economy itself. The consequence was deep bitterness and social fracture in communities already carrying the weight of industrial decline. And it reinforced a hard lesson. When the poor fight collectively, they are often treated as a security problem rather than a political constituency. And speaking of constituencies, when Britain finally confronted racism inside institutions, it wasn't because the nation suddenly became self-aware. It was because grief forced the issue into daylight. Fact 98. Institutional racism wasn't a slur. It was a finding. The setup is a murder that should have united the country in simple moral clarity. Stephen Lawrence, a black teenager, killed in a racist attack in London in 1993. The pivot is what followed. The investigation's failures and the campaign by Lawrence's family led to a public inquiry. The Macpherson report in 1999 concluded that the Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist, a phrase that landed like a slap because it named not just individual prejudice, but systemic patterns. The revelation is that institutions can produce racist outcomes even when many individuals believe themselves fair. That's what makes it so hard to face. It doesn't allow the comforting story that the problem is a few bad apples. It points at barrels, storage, supply chains. The consequence was reform efforts, debates, backlash, and ongoing questions about how far change went. But the deeper impact was psychological. Britain had to admit that its self-image of fairness was not a fact. It was an aspiration. And now we reach the final stretch, the fact that ties the others together, the one teachers rarely say out loud because it makes everything else harder to romanticize. Fact 99. Britain's most powerful weapon wasn't the gun. It was the paper that made the gun lawful. The setup of British history is often pageantry, crowns, speeches, parliament, procedure. Britain likes to imagine itself as a nation ruled by law, not by brute force. The pivot is that law can be the most efficient form of force ever invented. Across centuries, Britain built systems where suffering could be administered politely. Hunger turned into a work test, poverty turned into vagrancy, protest turned into conspiracy, colonial resistance turned into disturbance, and mass death turned into regrettable necessity. The revelation isn't that Britain was uniquely evil, it's that Britain was extraordinarily good at making power look normal, at wrapping coercion in forms, committees, commissions, and carefully worded justification. That paperwork did something important. It allowed ordinary people to participate without feeling like villains. A clerk stamps a document, a magistrate signs an order, a minister approves a policy, a newspaper prints the official line, and the violence becomes atmospheric, everywhere, but belonging to no one. The consequence is the most unsettling lesson of all. History's cruelties often don't require monsters. They require systems that make cruelty feel like procedure. And that is why these facts matter. Because if you can recognize the pattern, you can stop mistaking the paperwork for morality. Now, let's step back, breathe, and bring the thread together. If you've made it this far, you've probably felt the same creeping realization that historians and survivors often describe in quieter language. The worst parts of British history aren't always the dramatic moments with smoke and shouting. They're the policies that turned suffering into a routine, a law that made poverty suspicious, an institution built to be unpleasant on purpose, a reform that looked like progress from the outside while grinding people down inside. A moral story that blamed the hungry for being hungry, an empire that spoke about civilization while practicing control, then filed the paperwork and called it administration. And the uncomfortable truth is that none of these systems survived by accident. They survived because they were useful. They saved money, they protected property, they calmed elites, they made inequality feel deserved. They turned human lives into numbers that could be balanced, managed, moved, and, when necessary, discarded. But there's another truth running underneath the whole thing, and it's the one that keeps this from becoming pure despair. People resisted, they petitioned, they organized, they wrote, marched, struck, and refused to disappear. Reformers exposed scandals, families fought official lies. Survivors told the truth even when it cost them years of being doubted. Movements that were mocked as rabble eventually rewrote laws. Women who were force-fed made the state flinch. Workers who were blacklisted still found ways to stand together. Communities torn apart still carried memory forward, refusing to let the story end at the moment power wanted it to end. So if British history has a hidden curriculum, it's this. The national story isn't a gift handed down by kings and prime ministers, it's a battleground, and the version you were taught in school was often the version that keeps the battleground tidy. The point of revisiting these insane facts isn't to replace one myth with another, or to pretend Britain has nothing worth admiring. It's to strip away the comfortable idea that cruelty is always obvious, always foreign, always done by cartoon villains. The real danger, the one history keeps proving, is that cruelty can look like common sense if enough people agree not to stare at it for too long. So tonight, as you let this drift into the background, keep one thought at the front of your mind, because it's the one that turns history into something more than a grim story. Whenever someone tells you suffering is necessary, ask, necessary for whom? And if you want more long-form, sleep-friendly history that digs into the parts we were encouraged to forget, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which of these facts hit you hardest, because the archive is enormous and Britain has never run out of paperwork.